Hey guys, so this video is going to focus on installing a boost gauge to a 2008 Honda Civic Si sedan equipped with a Kraftwerk supercharger. I found a lot of useful tips online and am thankful for a lot of the help I've received, but I haven't found a complete kit that explains how to do everything from routing the vacuum hose to installing the gauge and setting up the wiring. So hopefully this video will serve as a helpful guide for those of you deciding to add this modification to your car. We're going to go ahead and get started with a few of the supplies I've assembled. Here's a pretty complete list of what I've bought so far. All of this came in underneath $40 from O'Reilly's here in the West Coast. I went ahead and I bought some 16 gauge wire to extend the power line that comes with the ProSport gauge. I contacted ProSport themselves because the power line they supply is a universal kit, which means that the line is not very long and is meant to be extended, and they recommended using 16 gauge wire. I also went ahead and bought some gold-plated fuses to hook the wires up. I added 4 ATA circuits. These are going to be used to tap into the mini fuse box that's located inside the cabin of the car. And then I went ahead and bought a barb fit adapter, which is going to go in the intake manifold and connect to our hose that will go to the boost gauge. I've bought some terminals that's going to be used for grounding, and if need be, I bought a universal extender to extend the vacuum line, which comes with the ProSport gauge. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to route the hosing yet, so if it comes up short, I can always buy the same diameter size vacuum hose and connect it with this universal T. Now let's take a look at what ProSport includes. Here's a list of parts that come with the ProSport gauge. You're going to be getting one power wire, which you need to break up and extend to those individual colors. I'm going to go more in depth on what each of those colors mean at a later part in the video. There is a daisy chain power wire if you want to hook up another gauge side by side with this. The benefit of using this daisy chain is it draws power from this gauge's wiring without having to add more extended wiring down to the mini fuse box in the cabin. The only gauge that will not work with this system is the AFR gauge, which is consequently what I am also going to install in a later video, so I'm not going to be using that. The kit also comes with a boost sensor, which is going to go inside the cabin. An inline filter, which basically goes in between the vacuum line. It's a sponge in the middle, shown in yellow, which is meant to collect moisture and debris to prevent it from entering the gauge. And there's also a T-fitting, as well as, of course, the boost hose that's going to go from the intake manifold eventually to the gauge. And then with this specific gauge, it does come with a touchpad control unit, which you can use to set peak boost, change the color, background, and a few other functions. These gauges can be ordered at ProSportGauges.com. If you type in ProSport Halo Gauge, which is the series of gauge that this is, there is a great video by Mach 5 Motorsports that explains the functions of the gauge. I've assembled a few tools to aid in the installation of the gauge. The first is going to be an Allen key. This size is going to be a 3/16. The reason for me using this key is to remove the barb fitting, which is already installed on my Kraftwerk's intake manifold. You might have a different way of tapping into the manifold. For the Kraftwerk's kit, it's a 3/16 Allen wrench. I've hooked it up to some vise pliers to add a little bit more leverage when unscrewing it. There's also a wire stripper that I'm going to be using. Wire cutter, good for the wires, as well as zip ties, which you will need a lot of to route it and secure it throughout the engine bay and inside the cabin, and also just to clean up any excess wiring. We also have a socket set, which I will be using to install the barb fitting I discussed earlier, as well as disassembling the battery at the very beginning. For the socket set, I'm using a 10mm drive for my battery and a 7/16 drive to install the barb fitting. I also have an extension to give myself a little bit more clearance. And lastly, some Loctite, which I'm going to thread around the barb fitting so that it does not come loose from the intake manifold. Another useful thing, which will be pointed out later in the video, is the Honda owner's manual. Your car should come with this, hopefully. If you turn to page 285 in this 2008 Honda Civic Si sedan manual, it lists the interior fuse box with descriptions of what each fuse is used for, the rated number of amps that is in that fuse, and whether the fuse is not being used. Another useful friend, as always, is your 8th Civic forum. I've went ahead and found a great thread started by Unplugged. Hope he doesn't mind. Appreciate him posting the same information on the fuses that I just showed you in the owner's manual. The great thing that he's included here, besides what's already in the manual, is the color designations for the different wires. If you take a look here, white is a constant power source, blue is for ignition, and so on. These will come in useful later when you're using the boost gauge installation instructions, because as you can see, some of them require wiring it to a source that has power all the time. Some of them require a different power source, but we'll get to that later. So that covers about all the materials and information that you're going to need to install the boost gauge. I've never done this before, and certainly would like anybody with more experience than me to add their opinions, hints, or any corrections that they saw during the installation. Hopefully this thing will go pretty smooth, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Alright, we're going to go ahead and get started and disconnect the negative side of the battery. Always a good idea before you do any kind of electrical work. As always, I'm using my safety glasses here, no matter how small the task. Always a good idea to protect your eyes. So let's go ahead and disconnect the negative side of the battery. I'm using my socket set, and for my connection, it's a 10mm drive. Yeah, that one's pretty stuck on there. We can just slide this through. And that's off. We're going to tuck it all the way underneath here so there's no accident of this glazing over the negative terminal. Just some advice, if you ever do a project where you have to disconnect and remove the battery entirely, make sure that you remove negative, then positive, and when it comes back to installing the battery, you're going to install in reverse, positive first, then negative. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the barb fitting on the intake manifold. Okay, so here's the barb fitting for my Craftworks intake manifold. We're going to take our 3/16 Allen wrench with my vice grip pliers and go ahead and get some leverage here and just remove this fitting. Here's the fitting. To find the correct barb size for your intake manifold, you might want to do what I did. I took this piece to my hardware store, used the thread guide that's in most hardware stores to find the correct thread type and size to use. We're going to go ahead and grab that barb fitting. and put some Loctite and install it on. Alright, so here's the barb fitting with some blue Loctite around of it. You don't need a whole bunch of this stuff, just enough to coat each side. We're going to go ahead and thread this in by hand first. And once you're sure that it's going in smoothly, there's no chance of cross-threading this, we can go ahead and use our socket set with a 7/16 drive for me. And this is going in pretty easily, which confirms that this is the correct size. Okay, that looks nice and secure. Let's go ahead and talk about the hose for the vacuum and routing this from the engine bay to the inside of the cabin. Here are the next parts we're going to be using for the boost gauge. We have the boost hose. We also have some plastic loom, which provides a little bit of heat insulation, especially in the engine bay. We have a T-fitting, which I'm actually not going to be using because I am tapping into a port that already exists on my intake manifold. Some of you might have to use this fitting if you have to tap into an existing vacuum line. And we're also going to be using some zip ties here. I want to definitely give a shout out to JR or Jay Rickman or Ricker. Guy's definitely been awesome in giving me great advice on what to use and what accessories and fuses to tap into for this installation. So thanks a lot, man. Appreciate your help so far. Let's go ahead and take a look at what I've done inside the engine bay for routing the wiring. Alright, so the hose that came with my kit was way too short. If I had decided to run the hose directly from here to the right side, which is where I plan on doing it for a reason I'll go over later, I probably would have had enough. I personally wanted to keep it away from the hot engine parts, so what I had to do was buy a longer hose that is the same diameter and also a vacuum hose. That's this one right here. In O'Reilly or AutoZone, this is called washer fluid hose / vacuum hose. This one is okay to use for boost gauges, and what we're going to go ahead and do is just connect this in. And one thing I did notice is this type of hosing was, actually that's not really a good route because I have a kink in there. This type of hosing was much easier to put over the barb fitting than the one supplied by ProSport. There is a great tip that I found online. If the vacuum hose that you're supplied with your boost gauge is very stiff and hard to get over the barb fitting, one thing you can do is soak it in very warm water, let it sit there for a minute or two, take it out, dry it lightly, and then put it over the fitting. The warm water will help to make the diameter of the hose a little bit more malleable. Another thing I'd like to point out is